You're listening to Let's Talk Creation.
Well, Happy New Year, everybody. And it's fabulous to be back for more episodes of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And as always, do remember to subscribe, hit the notification bell, like and share our episodes, leave us a comment or a question. Our audience is growing, and it really helps if you kind of share the good news with your friends about the podcast, and we do appreciate all of that. And we've got loads of good stuff coming up for you in this new year of 2023.
Definitely.
This first episode of the year, we're actually going to revisit a topic that we began to sort of touch on briefly a few episodes back. You may remember, if you're a regular listener, that we had Dr. Joe Francis on the show talking to us about microbes and viruses and all forms of other microbiology. And our conversation on that occasion started to sort of take a turn into what's quite a tough question to deal with, which is the question of natural evils. So things like diseases and parasites and pathogens and all of those kinds of things. And we thought that today we'd sort of unpack that question a bit more. In fact, it's going to be one of those topics, I think, where we're not going to be able to deal with it adequately in one episode. So this is probably going to turn into another one of those occasional series that we do, where we'll keep coming back to this topic in future episodes as well, because there's a lot to deal with. And as Todd reminded me when we were talking about this episode, it is a real can of worms. You know, once you open this can, you know, who knows what's going to come out. So, so it's a fascinating topic. So this episode really is just by way of introduction to the whole question of what we might call the problem of natural evil. And one of the other things that I think we should say right from the outset is that we probably don't have lots of easy answers to offer you to many of the questions that you have. But hey, you know, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, then hopefully you're used to that by now. You know that. You know that we like to sort of delve into these topics thoroughly. We like to think about them deeply. We don't want to sort of rush to simplistic or superficial answers. That's why you're here, right? Because you enjoy those kind of deep dives into these subjects. So that's what we're going to do with the problem of natural evil. And now, Todd, where do we kind of begin with this? I guess the place we need to begin, as always, surprise, surprise, is with the Bible itself.
That's a good place to start. Yeah.
Right. So what does the book of Genesis, tell us about this question? And I suppose we should start with the goodness of the original creation and the goodness of its creator.
Yeah.
So why don't you kick us off there?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little brief here because I hope that if you're listening to this podcast, you've heard these ideas before, right? So the basic concept is that God, and this is not just the basic concept of creationism, this is the basic concept throughout the history of the church. And the idea is that God created a world that was good, perfectly good, whatever that means, perfectly good. And that the sin that was committed by Adam and Eve when they ate the forbidden fruit brought in a curse from God. And that curse then resulted in the sort of misery that we have today. And this is complicated because different people will have different ideas about what that means, right? So for some people, it's just, right. It's very limited, right? It's very limited. It might be, they might think that the curse is a spiritual curse that produces just a disruption of relationships between humans and creation and between humans and other humans. And then others, like myself, we would understand the curse to be what's usually called a cosmic curse, where the fundamental way that the universe works has been altered. And the way God presents things in Genesis 1 through 3, you get the sense, at least I get the sense, and a lot of other creationists get the sense that death is something that came through sin, right? And we get that explicitly in Paul's letters, the Apostle Paul's letters, not you, but the Apostle Paul's letters in the New Testament, right? And so, so if that's true, then that requires a very different sort of world than the one we're living in. And so that's the basic outline of how a creationist would respond to, various things like, why we die in the first place, why there are diseases, why there are disasters, and so forth. It's all going back to humanity messed up the good creation that God made.
Yeah.
And so now we suffer.
Yeah. And of course, that raises, as you say, lots of questions about what all of that means. And it's probably not the time in this episode to get into all of those questions. But I've got loads of questions about that. I'd love to pick your brains about what very good means in Genesis 1:31.
Yes.
Does it mean perfection?
And what,
or does it mean something else?
And even if it meant perfection, what would that mean? Perfectly,
right,
perfectly,
what
perfectly what? Perfectly, perfect.
Yes.
What does that mean? Right? Is there, does perfect entail no change ever? And I can't see how that's the case because God, in Genesis 1, God commands creatures to be fruitful and multiply. So he clearly has in mind that creation is going to grow and change over time. So perfection, I think, this notion that we would be in this, world where nothing ever changes, I don't think that's what God had in mind for creation. But you're right. That's probably a subject for a future episode.
Yes. Yeah. So, and there's all kinds of corollaries to that. What does very good mean? Does it mean functional goodness, that creation is just fit for purpose, or does it have some moral dimension to it? There's all kinds of questions, and we can't get into all of that. But maybe those are topics that we will come back to as we think about this question of natural evil in future episodes. Yep. But that kind of gives us at least a sort of framework, I think, for how creationists think about this. So there was this very good creation, whatever that means, that is fallen and cursed, and that this has had an effect on the physical creation. It's not just about broken relationships between humans, but it's about something physical. It's about the origin of death. It's about the origin of a curse, perhaps, on the ground. Well, the curse on the ground. Yes. We have the thorns and thistles, and we have references with Eve to pain in childbirth, and you have the curse on the serpent, who is cursed above all the cattle and the other beasts of the field, and and what that might mean. So for creationists, this is something that has cosmic significance, cosmic scope.
And so it's gigantic too, right? What you're describing there is that's not a simple alteration, right? Now you're going to die instead of now you're going to live forever. Yeah. It's a massive overhaul of the entire world. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. So it really is sort of cosmic in scope. And so the world that we look at today, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 8, is a world that is subjected to futility and to corruption, and is groaning in some sense, anticipating its liberation when the children of God are revealed. all of that implies that there's something wrong with the creation itself, the physical creation in which we live. And of course, as we look around at the creation, we see all kinds of evidence of pain and suffering and agony and bloodshed and disease and all of these things. And we wonder how all of this can be squared with the goodness of God, the goodness of the one who made it. So that brings us then to the very problem that we want to deal with, which is the classical problem of evil, as it's often referred to. And that problem has several different aspects or dimensions. I think we can think about it in lots of different ways. And one of those ways is a kind of there's a philosophical form of the argument, isn't there? The argument to do with the problem of evil. So just help us, Todd, just sort of unpack that a bit.
So philosophically, you can sort of present the problem of evil like this. You have a couple of premises that lead you to a conclusion. Premise number one would be that God is perfectly good, which as a Christian theist, I would accept. God is perfectly good. And the second premise would be that God is all-powerful. God possesses all the power in the universe, which, again, as a Christian theist, I would accept that as well. God does have all the power in the universe. And then the third premise is that real evil exists. And looking around in the world, definitely agree. And it's not just, diseases and disasters. We can think about just the wickedness that people perpetrate on one another. It's terrible. So we don't really need to belabor that. That's real. So we've got God is good. God is all powerful, and real evil exists. And so the conclusion then is something's wrong here. Something's wrong with our premises. Either, and the classical way you would think through this is either God is perfectly good, but is not capable of eliminating evil, in which case he is not all powerful. Or God is all powerful and he can eliminate evil, but he doesn't want to, or he won't, in which case he is not good. Or you can simply say, the entire concept of God is incoherent and self-contradictory, and you can't hold all those ideas together. And so God is he's just a fairy tale. You just created this weird sky man who can't possibly exist because of all these self-contradictions. So that's essentially the problem of evil, as it's sort of classically understood.
Yeah. And it's often presented in the way that you explained there as a fairly standard anti-theistic argument, an argument against the existence of God.
Right.
That God can't be as described in the Bible, all powerful and all good.
Right.
Because of this problem of the existence of evil. So what kind of responses then have been made to this argument? And I'm aware that, this is a massive area of discussion among philosophers and theologians, and volumes and volumes and volumes have been written on this subject, and all kinds of different ways of tackling it have been proposed. But just help us to sort of navigate through some of those key responses.
A couple of responses. One response might be that the very notion of evil is presupposing some kind of standard of good, objective standard of good, right? So in the very making of the argument, you are admitting that there is some kind of objective standard of good out there that binds us to a certain moral behavior. Which then, where does that come from? And then that turns into the moral argument for the existence of God, which is kind of funny. So some philosophers will take this and twist it back around and say, well, really what you've done is you've created an argument for God's existence by trying to make this argument against it. So that's one possible response. I think the more common that I see among theologians and philosophers is simply to appeal to the oversimplification of the argument, that we don't include the full concept of who God is, full understanding of who God is in our argument there. And so in that sense, we've oversimplified and we've come to a false conclusion. So the most common approach to that would be to say that God permits evil now for a time with a good goal in mind for the end, right?
Okay.
So you might think here, an example might be chemotherapy, right? For cancer. You find out that you have cancer. The doctor says you have to take this chemotherapy. And, no matter, there's been a lot of advances in chemotherapy, but basically what chemotherapy is doing to you, it's a poison. You are taking poison that you hope will kill the cancer before it kills you. Chemotherapy is it's not pleasant. It's not, it's good in the ultimate long-term sense because it may save your life. But in the short-term sense, it's a miserable thing to experience because it's poison. You're poisoning yourself. So that would be kind of an analogy here that, we suffer some evils now, but in the long run, God has a greater good in mind. And maybe we don't understand what that is, but it's at least possible that that's coming, right? And of course, the classic response to that is, well, what good is Hitler, or something like that. Yeah. It gets complicated. And yes, philosophers can go on and on and on about this. And then, like you say, we're going to have to unpack a lot of this in future episodes.
Sure. So in other words, we could at least conceive that God has a higher purpose.
Right.
In allowing temporary suffering, allowing evil temporarily to kind of hold sway.
Correct.
But with a greater good in mind. Yeah. And because we're limited and finite human beings, we may not even know what those purposes are, because God's will is inscrutible and in some sense sort of unknowable to us, at least this side of eternity.
Right.
And I think that is at least conceivable, isn't it? Yeah. We can conceive that there might be some purpose we don't understand. But I can also see how some people sort of shrug at that and find that a bit unsatisfying because they look around and they see what they regard as gratuitous evil, and they can't possibly think of, why that would be allowed to happen.
Right.
So that's one kind of response. What's the second kind of response? I know there was something called the best of all possible worlds defense,
yes.
I think is how it's referred to.
Yeah, so we're kind of straying away here from the philosophy into the science, which is where I like to dwell, right? I like to think about not just evil as an abstraction, right? But evil as a specific thing, right?
Right.
So there was this German philosopher in the early 1700s who published this pamphlet in German, and he introduced this idea that what we're living in is the best of all possible worlds. If you can imagine any other world, it would be not as good as this one. This one is the world that has basically maximized goodness.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting idea. And it really starts to get into the whole realm, the obsession of the 1700s with this notion that we can infer God and his attributes from observing creation. This was the natural theology movement. William Paley and his design arguments fall into this. And the best of all possible worlds. It's an interesting idea. And it requires you to sort of think about the actual world in which we live, beyond just the abstraction of, people suffer and die and other creatures suffer and die. There is a very specific thing, right? Because it invites you to think about, well, what would the world be like if there were no mosquitoes or if there were no tapeworms, right? You start to have to think about these sorts of things. And that to me is kind of the interesting part of the whole.
Yeah.
This is where I get interested in the problem of natural evil, because this is a place where I think biology and science really has a lot to offer in sort of giving an account for, well, why do these things happen, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, best of all possible worlds.
Yeah. So the German philosopher I think that you're referring to there is Gottfried Leibniz.
Leibniz.
He was kind of a 17th century rationalist. He was part of that sort of movement. And as I've thought about this, I've always had a problem with this kind of best of all possible worlds.
Oh, good.
idea. And I think it's one of the same objections that Alvin Plantinga, the Christian philosopher, has sort of articulated about this idea, which is that it's not actually that difficult to conceive of a better world in some ways. I can always think of a world in which I didn't stub my toe this morning, or why is that not possible as a better possible world? So, so it's a kind of interesting defense, but like you say, it has been discussed, at great length in the philosophical and theological literature, and it has all kinds of interesting ramifications for, how we think about the world. And as we begin to sort of unpack all of this, what we're really sort of delving into here is what Christians often refer to as theodicy, right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Theodicy is kind of the vindication of God in view of the existence of evil.
Right.
That's what a theodicy is. Yeah. And so the Christian approach has often been to sort of justify that there are reasons why God permits evil to exist temporarily, or because it's the best possible world, it optimizes goodness in some way, or whatever. So there are all these kinds of different responses, and they're all sort of in this realm of theodicy.
And I would say here,
now,
I want to respond to your idea there that it's not a very good argument. That it's easy to imagine a world better than this one, because you're right. It's true. And it's not just that, but when you look into the history of what these folks were arguing when they were arguing for the best of all possible worlds, you find some really strange stuff. So, for example, William Paley, in his book Natural Theology, which is very well known in creation circles, sure. I sense a lot of respect for Paley and his design arguments. But at the same time, Paley argues explicitly that the greatest goal of creation is happiness, and that God has made everything with the attributes that it has so that it can achieve its own happiness. And this is where it really goes off the rails, death is necessary for happiness. If there is no death, you cannot be happy. So, so Paley's always been sort of a mixed bag for me. I think he's got some really interesting insights, but at the same time, his larger perspective on creation, where it came from, what it means, has really gone, I think, off the rails. With this enshrinement of death as being important and necessary for happiness. I don't think that's true. You also get,
and you end up with these weird arguments, in the natural theologians. God created bed bugs in order to promote cleanliness. That's and all this kind of stuff. So weird. That's justifications for
straight out of John Ray and the works of God manifested in his creation. And he basically says lice exist for that reason. Lice make us want to be cleaner.
Right.
Which, all right.
Yeah.
Sure, I guess. Maybe. In my worldview, lice are a result of the fall and the curse. You don't like them because they're gross and you shouldn't. So there you go.
Yeah. And I think also there might be quite a number of theologians and so on who would want to take issue with the idea that happiness is the ultimate goal of everything.
Yeah.
The framers of the Great Confessions might have something to say about that.
Yep.
The chief end of man is to glorify God, rather than human happiness.
Yeah.
So that's got
some weird stuff when you really dig into it. There's some weird business in that best of all possible worlds stuff. So, but I'll give them credit though. Yeah. They make us think about, the world as it is, and they make us think more carefully about could the world have been better? Could this world that we live in have been better in the past in a way that would make sense in light of the curse and the fall? Right. So I'll give it.
And that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really important. Now, when we talk about natural evils, we haven't actually really sort of defined what we mean.
Right.
We've sort of talked generally about the problem of evil, but there are moral evils, which are, actions that human agents do, things that we do that are morally wrong, morally evil. Mm-hmm. But then there's this category that is referred to as natural evil.
Right.
What would you understand by natural evil?
Well,
in contradistinction to moral evil.
Sure, yeah, in distinction to that. So I would think, we'd have to have, first of all, a sort of standard to think through things, right? So when I burn my hand on the stove, that hurts, and it hurts a lot. But it hurts because I'm designed to protect myself from burning, right? God gave me a really good nervous system and a lot of pain receptors so that I would know not to stick my hand in a fire and cook my hand. So, so that seems bad to hurt like that, but it's good and it's accomplishing what God designed my body to do. So it's kind of tricky. So for me, I'm always going to go back to the young age creationist idea that death is the bad thing, right? That physical death in some way. And again, you're going to unpack a lot of worms out of that can. But in some sense, physical death is the standard by which we can judge what is naturally evil and what is not, right? And so maybe we could look at it and say, okay, well, I can see maybe two big categories of things that cause death that we might include in this world of natural evil. We might say that there are sort of the physical realm that we live in, the planet we live on, and the things that happen to it, rocks that fall out of the sky and volcanoes that erupt and storms and all that wrapped together. That's one class. And I think that has a sort of, you get into sort of astronomy and physics and cosmogony, the origin of the universe, to try to sort of sort through, first of all, why do these things happen? And second of all, could you imagine a world where they were not as bad, or maybe not bad at all? And then there's the sort of world where the side of the equation where you have the world of living things, right? As Tennyson described it, the nature red in tooth and claw, right? So why do these things exist that go around killing other things like us, right? So I kind of divide it that way because it seems to me that it's kind of a nice geology, physical science division versus sort of biology, life science division. roughly.
Yeah.
But again, these are kinds of sort of scientific questions, right? Why do we have hurricanes? Why do we have earthquakes? Why do we have AIDS? Why do we have COVID? Why do we have lions that hunt other creatures and so forth? So that's kind of the way I would start to divide it up, to think about things.
Yeah. That's very helpful. So we've got the kind of natural disasters, and then we've got the sort of biological evils and that kind of thing. The predators and the pathogens.
Yeah. So
and I think you're right. I think in some sense, when you think about those natural disasters, you could imagine an argument that perhaps there's some kind of necessity in that sort of best possible worlds kind of way for plate tectonics, and that inevitably means that you're going to have volcanoes and earthquakes and that kind of thing. You could see how somebody might reason that way. I'm not sold on that idea, but you could see how,
because I think
you could see how that.
Yeah, because we have the planet that we do, and it exists the way it is, and so this is just a side consequence. And so if you don't want to be killed in a volcanic eruption, don't live next to a volcano. If you don't want to be, swept away in a hurricane, don't live on the beach in Hurricane Alley, right? And, but I think this is important, and we're probably going to have some more episodes to unpack this claim. But I do think our creation model, that is current among a lot of the creation science world, offers us some pretty interesting explanations for an array of natural disaster phenomenon that go right back to the curse and sin. So you mentioned earthquakes and volcanoes as a consequence of plate tectonics, right? Well, the plate tectonics, as you know, factors into the best model we have for how the world was flooded in the days of Noah, right? And so, that's really interesting. Why did God send the flood? Because people were wicked and he was going to wipe them out. So suddenly, if you think about volcanoes and earthquakes and that sort of tsunamis, for example, that becomes a consequence, a sort of an echo of the punishment that was inflicted on the world during the days of Noah because of human sin, which I think is really interesting. And I think, storms are a little harder to squeeze in there, but I do think there are ways to do that as well. So that what you end up with is the world, the sort of shaky, unstable, scary world that we live in, turns out to be a consequence of human sin. And in that, then you might imagine maybe the world was different the way God created it originally. And it was through the flood, the transformation of the flood, that we have these sort of disasters today. So for me, this is one of the most exciting aspects of young age creation theory, is that we suddenly open up this whole world of possible explanations for the origin of these sorts of natural evils that so many theologians and philosophers have wondered about over the years. We have some ideas that might actually work pretty well.
Yeah. And as we began to sort of explore a few episodes ago with Joe Francis,
right,
a similar kind of argument can be made with respect to biological evils, in the sense that so often these biological evils appear to have arisen by modification of some design that was otherwise harmless or even beneficial.
Right.
But it's been corrupted or it's degenerated. Now, this is not always the case. There are some really hard examples, as we know. But it's a kind of common theme, isn't it? That when we begin to look at some of these biological evils, very often there seems to be evidence that this could have had a beneficial function originally.
Yeah, or at
least not have been harmful.
Right. Yeah, back when I was teaching origins at Bryan College to college students, biological origins. We would talk about natural evil for a couple of lectures. And I would, I had this little mnemonic that I used to help them remember things. I said, think of 4 Ps, predators, parasites, pathogens, and poisons. And those are terrible categories because they sort of overlap in many significant ways, and you cram things in there that don't really belong. But that was basically the idea was, you have predators that hunt and kill other animals. You have pathogens that cause diseases. You have parasites that live off other creatures and cause harm to them. And you have poisons, these substances, biological or otherwise, that cause suffering and death. And so, and like you say, it's a fascinating thing to look through the array of things in the world that appear to be quite unpleasant in the biological world, and realize this is very often a close variant to something that's perfectly harmless. The example we gave during Joe's episode was anthrax. One of the examples we gave was anthrax, where you have this, it's just a cousin to this soil bacterium, and it's part of the attributes of the soil bacterium to make spores is what gets it into your lungs, which then allows it to spread around into your bloodstream and kill you really quickly. So yeah, you get this sense that creation, at least some biological aspects of creation, are not far away from a harmless or maybe even a beneficial relationship, instead of the sort of pathological relationships that we see that cause the unpleasantness and the suffering and the death.
Yeah. That's very, very helpful. So we've looked at this question then of some natural evil from a number of, different angles. We've looked at this philosophical argument. We've looked at the scientific sorts of questions that arise, but to kind of lead us on from there. Let's imagine let's do a thought experiment. So let's imagine that we actually were able to resolve these questions that we've raised with absolute to our satisfaction. Yeah. Okay. So we are happy that we have got some kind of solution to these problems. And you've already said that you think there are some indications that the creation model might help to offer some answers, to some of these questions at least. Is that the end of the argument? Have we solved the problem of evil?
This is where I no, I don't think so. I don't think we do. And I think that in the world of sort of philosophy and science, and in the world of creationism, I think there is this sort of idea that, when disaster strikes, we can explain it because we know about the fall, and we know about sin, and we know about the punishment for sin, and we know about the hope in Jesus Christ that he's coming back and going to institute the kingdom of God, in which these miseries are going to go away. There is another aspect to this problem, and that is the personal, the sort of existential question of, okay, fine, I understand why hurricanes have to happen. I understand why, diseases happen, but why did it have to happen to me? Right?
Right.
Why did my mom have to have surgery? Why did my dad get cancer? Why did my friend die of COVID? Why was my cousin in whatever, some, school shooting or whatever? Why is it that it has to happen to me? Right. So we can understand in this sort of abstract sense why these things take place. But that, God still is in control, right? That's still part of our confession as Christians, that God maintains control and supervises the details of our lives. And so, yeah, I can say, okay, I get it. Hurricanes happen and disasters strike and whatever. But they should happen to other people because I'm a Christian and I trust God, and he should have, he's working all things together for my good. And so why did this happen to me? It's a much more difficult question.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a question, I think, that often we usually can't give an answer to. We can't say why, we can't answer the question of why you particularly suffered a specific accident, illness, bereavement, whatever it is. We don't know why that happened. So in a sense, even if we can offer sort of satisfying answers at an academic or intellectual level to the philosophical problems and the scientific problems, actually it still leaves suffering and all of these bad things as an existential question for me.
Yeah, it's
for us as individuals.
It still leaves us. Why is this happening?
Yeah. Yeah. So where does that leave us then, Todd? We need to kind of begin to wind up.
Yeah.
Because
I find myself, thinking about this existential problem, and I find myself, I can't, like you say, the big academic answers don't answer those questions. And if I was trying to advise someone who is experiencing a particularly terrible form of suffering, I would never want to advise them with some abstraction about the fall and plate tectonics, and this is why we have earthquakes, and that's why you were in a terrible earthquake that wiped out your house and your entire family. That would be terrible, right? And at the same time, we're not, you and me aren't counselors. We're not grief counselors. And you can see why. This is the best we can do is, the plate tectonics. And, So it's not, I don't think this is an aspect of the problem of evil that we are probably going to return to much in future episodes, just because it's so individual. It's so personal. It's not something that we can deal with. We can deal with the sort of abstractions, and we will in probably lots of episodes, but struggling with the personal tragedies that strike people, that's for pastors, that's for counselors, that's for your God, right? That's for Jesus to help us through with. Having said that, sort of reminds me of the God's answer to the problem of suffering. And this is something I think we want to think about as we kind of close off this episode here. And I don't think it's something that a lot of people, in the academic world are really, I don't know. I think we understand it, but we don't necessarily really promote it because it's not a very academic answer that really satisfies us academically. But God's answer to suffering is to suffer with us, which is really weird, right? So you've got all these religions in the world who have all these ideas about where suffering comes from. You've got your religions that just deny that suffering is real, and ask you to sort of get beyond your whatever mental whatever that binds you to this false idea of suffering and move on to the higher enlightenment where you see there is no suffering. That's not very satisfying. You get other religions that sort of lean into God relishing the cause of suffering, right? Some people are worshiping a God who is a bit sinister and dangerous, and he really likes punishing the unbelievers and the infidels. Scary stuff. But our God put aside his glory and came down here in a body and suffered right alongside of us. And through that suffering, then, he made a way for us to be redeemed, right? It is through the suffering that he saves the world, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's
extraordinary to me that what we refer to as the curse, which involved death, in God's providence and in his goodness, becomes the cure.
Yeah.
The curse becomes the cure.
Yeah.
It's through Christ's death on the cross, through his suffering, which was physical. Let's not forget that.
Right.
We so often spiritualize these things, but when we share the communion together, we're talking about a broken body and shed blood. This was very physical.
Yeah.
And it was through that very physical atonement that, we're able to be reconciled to God and ultimately share with him in his resurrection from the dead and in his abundant new life.
And
so the curse has become the cure.
Yeah, the curse is the cure. And it's not just, let's just add this in there. There's also emotional suffering, a great deal of emotional suffering that Jesus endured. You see it all sorts of places. You see him responding to dumb questions with, "How long do I have to put up with you people?" Boy, there's a passage I relate to really well. But you also see him as he's praying in the garden the night before his death. He's crying. He's so intensely focused on what he's about to do that blood vessels are bursting in his sweat glands and he's sweating drops of blood. He's already started bleeding before the punishment has even begun. So he shed his own blood, literally. He started that. He started the shedding of the blood, which I think is an extraordinary thing to realize. And it was through that emotional anguish, that desperate plea of, God, if there's any other way, Father, if there's any other way, let's do that. But there is no other way. So he had to endure the physical side of suffering.
And there's even an echo there of Eden as he sheds these drops of blood. Part of the curse on Adam was that in the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread. Yep. And Jesus is bearing the curse.
Yeah, he's
to become the great cure.
Quite literally bearing the curse. And like you say, the ultimate, I guess the ultimate question of why do we suffer and die like this is that this is God's salvation. It's the way God is saving the world. Literally, right? He had to institute death because death is a consequence of sin, right? And so if that's the case, then that means somebody's going to have to die to pay the price for sin. And no one can do it unless he just wipes out everybody. And so he does it for us as a perfect sacrifice. So death had to exist in order for him to die so that he could save us from death. It's super complicated. Death is a curse and it's a cure at the same time. Oh, very strange. But if I were counseling, I'm not a counselor, but that's kind of the approach we'd have to take is that, God knows and Jesus knows your suffering because he suffered too. God knows your heartbreak and your heartache because he had the same experiences here too. When you see the book of Job, I think, I keep coming back to Job, man, Job does the same thing. All through the book of Job, he is asking for the right to approach God and argue his case, right? And when God finally shows up, Job does not do any of that. And Job seems quite satisfied, which is kind of an irony because all Job has wanted to do is say, God, I didn't do anything wrong. And when God shows up, God's response is, I know what I'm doing. And Job realizes in the presence of God that that's what he really wanted in the first place. He didn't want to know. If God had come to him and told him, oh yeah, I had a bet with the devil that you wouldn't break. That's a terrible thing, right? That's not going to make Job feel good at all. It's going to make him feel even worse. But God's presence is enough because that's what Job really wanted. And yeah, that's what we really want. We really want Jesus to pick us up and put us in his lap and tell us that everything is going to be okay. And that, yeah, it hurts now, but it won't hurt forever. And there's a hope for the future. And that's the answer to the problem of suffering.
Yes. And that's a great place for us to finish this episode, I think. That's been a great introduction. And I hope that's been helpful to our listeners. Do send us your feedback. If you found this episode helpful, or if you've got other comments, feedback that you'd like to send to us, remember you can leave a comment on our YouTube videos, or you can email us at podcast@coresci.org. That's coresci.org. Check out all of our streaming platforms and our show notes for each episode. You can do that at coresci.org/podcast. As we said at the beginning, don't forget to subscribe, to like and share our episodes. Leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast streaming platform, or whatever it is. Leave us a like. Share the episodes with your friends. Spread the word. All of that is very, very welcome. And donations, we are only able to continue bringing the podcast to you because of the support from our listeners, and we are very grateful to those who do help us in that way. We are very, very appreciative for all of your donations and your prayers. Todd, if someone would like to support the podcast and they wanted to give to Core Academy of Science, how do they do that? You can visit us at coresci.org/connect to find out links to all of our interesting content, including our donate page, or you can just go to coresci.org/donate. There you will find information that will explain how you can support us by check, or you'll find a link where you can become a monthly supporter online through PayPal. That's great. And if anyone would like to help support the podcast by giving to Biblical Creation Trust, we have a website, biblicalcreationtrust.org. And if you go to our homepage, there's a button you can click on the homepage, takes you to a giving page, and all of the options for giving are listed on that page, including a PayPal account if you're outside of the UK. But there are a whole host of other ways you can give to us, particularly if you're based in the United Kingdom. So once again, we do really appreciate all of your support. Okay, well, that's the first episode of the new year. Yeah. And I think that's got us off to a good start. And I know we've got some really exciting things lined up. So I guess we should just leave our listeners and viewers hanging because we're not entirely sure what's coming next. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks to find out. But meanwhile, Happy New Year. Yep, Happy New Year. Stay tuned.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.